Move the car. Drivers don't stand at the front entrance. The words cut through the crisp morning air like a blade, sharp enough to turn heads across the polished glass lobby of Cole Dynamics headquarters in downtown Chicago, where suits moved with purpose and coffee cups cost more than most hourly wages. And right there at the curb, beneath a sleek overhang designed for executives, stood a black man in a simple charcoal hoodie and worn-in jeans. One hand resting lightly on the door of a black luxury sedan that still hummed from the drive, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, like he had heard that tone before and filed it away without reaction. Because this wasn't new. Not the assumption, not the dismissal, not the quiet certainty in someone else's voice that they knew exactly where he belonged and where he didn't. And yet something about the stillness in his stance didn't match the role they had assigned him, something too grounded, too deliberate, like a man standing in a place he understood better than anyone else there. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now back to Darius Cole. He didn't move, not immediately. Even as the man who had spoken, a tall white executive in a navy suit with a badge clipped proudly to his lapel, gestured impatiently with two fingers like swatting away an inconvenience, because in that brief pause, something subtle shifted, the kind of silence that doesn't beg for approval but demands observation. And Darius simply looked past him, through the revolving doors, into the building's interior, where LED screens flickered with quarterly growth numbers, and company slogans about innovation and leadership, words that floated high above the reality unfolding at the curb. Because down here, leadership was being judged by appearance, filtered through bias, reduced to a single assumption: driver. "You heard me," the executive added, louder this time, his voice carrying just enough for nearby employees to glance over, their curiosity flickering into quiet judgment. Because in a place like this, people learned quickly who mattered and who didn't, and Darius, in that moment, had been placed firmly in the second category. Still, he didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't explain because he didn't need to. Not yet. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the car door, letting it close with a soft, controlled click that echoed more than it should have in the charged air. And then he stepped forward, not toward the street as instructed, but toward the entrance itself, his pace unhurried, measured, like each step had already been decided long before this morning ever began. Inside, a young receptionist glanced up from her screen, her smile forming out of habit before faltering as her eyes traced his clothes, recalibrating in real time. And beside her, another employee leaned in slightly, whispering something under his breath that ended with a quiet chuckle, the kind that wasn't meant to be heard but always was. And near the security desk, a guard straightened, already anticipating the interaction, already preparing to enforce a boundary that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with perception. Outside, the executive exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if confirming his own assumption, then turned away, already done with the situation, already certain of its outcome. Because in his version of the story, this was simple: a driver who didn't know his place. But inside, as Darius crossed the threshold into the building, something else was unfolding, something quieter but far more significant. Because the system he had built, the structure he understood down to its smallest detail, was about to reveal itself in a way no one in that lobby was prepared for. And as he walked past the reception desk, without stopping, without asking for permission, without acknowledging the tension tightening behind him, the air itself seemed to shift, just slightly, just enough for the first hint of doubt to creep in, because there was something about the way he moved, something unshaken, something that didn't align with the role they had already assigned him. And for the first time, someone in that room hesitated just for a second, just long enough to wonder if they had gotten it wrong. Darius Cole did not slow down as he moved deeper into the lobby, his footsteps steady against the polished marble floor, each one landing with quiet certainty that contrasted sharply with the tension building behind him. Because now the eyes were on him, not just one or two, but several, glances turning into stares, curiosity blending with discomfort as the situation no longer fit neatly into the assumptions made just moments earlier outside. And at the reception desk, the young woman straightened in her chair, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as if unsure whether to greet him or stop him, her training telling her one thing while her instinct whispered something else entirely. And beside her, the man who had laughed earlier shifted his posture, the humor gone from his face, replaced by something closer to caution as Darius approached without hesitation, without asking for direction, without even glancing at the visitor sign and tablet that sat prominently at the edge of the desk like a gatekeeper for everyone who entered this space. "Sir, you cannot just walk in like that," the receptionist said finally, her voice polite but firm, the kind of tone shaped by company guidelines, yet carried a slight tremor, subtle but present, as if even she was not fully convinced of the authority she was trying to assert. And Darius stopped then, not because she had told him to, but because he had reached exactly where he intended to be, right in front of the desk, with a company logo rose behind her in brushed steel letters that caught the morning light. And for a brief second he looked at it, not admiring it, not questioning it, just acknowledging it like a man recognizing something familiar, something that belonged to him in a way no one else in that room could understand. "I am expected upstairs," he said calmly, his voice even, controlled, carrying no urgency, no need to prove anything, just a statement placed carefully into the space between them. And the receptionist blinked, her eyes flicking to his clothes again, then back to his face, searching for something that would align his words with her expectations, but finding nothing that made sense. And behind him, the security guard stepped closer, his presence growing more pronounced, not aggressive, but assertive, the kind of posture meant to signal control without needing to escalate. And yet the line had already begun to blur, because what was supposed to be routine was no longer predictable. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" the guard asked, his tone measured, professional, but edged with doubt, and Darius turned his head slightly toward him, just enough to acknowledge the question without shifting his stance. And for a moment the two men stood there, one holding authority by position, the other by something far less visible but far more grounded. And Darius reached into his pocket, not hurried, not defensive, simply deliberate, pulling out his phone and glancing at the screen as if confirming something already known. And in that small motion there was a quiet shift, something subtle that made the guard hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, because there was no uncertainty in Darius, no sign of someone out of place, only the calm precision of someone moving exactly as intended. Across the lobby, near a bank of elevators, a young intern named Caleb Foster paused mid-step, his badge swinging slightly against his chest as he looked over, his brow furrowing as he watched the interaction unfold, because something about it felt off, not dramatic, not loud, but wrong in a way that did not sit easily. And Caleb had seen enough onboarding emails, enough internal announcements to recognize certain names, certain patterns, and while he could not place it immediately, something about the man at the desk stirred a faint memory, like a file half opened in the back of his mind, waiting to be clicked into focus. "We need to verify you before you can go any further," the receptionist continued, her confidence returning in small increments as procedure gave her something to hold on to, and she turned the tablet toward him, the sign and screen glowing with empty fields that demanded identity, demanded explanation, demanded proof of belonging. And Darius looked at it briefly, then back at her, and the silence that followed was not awkward, not uncertain, but intentional, stretching just long enough to shift the weight of the moment, because he did not reach for the tablet, did not type his name, did not comply in the way expected, and behind the desk the man beside her leaned in again, his voice lower this time but still audible. "Told you, he is just a driver trying to wander in." And the words hung there, heavier now, no longer casual, because they had been spoken in a space where doubt was beginning to grow. Caleb took a step closer, his curiosity pulling him in despite himself, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Darius's face, searching his memory, and then it flickered, not fully formed but enough to make his pulse quicken, because he had seen that name before, not in person, not in a meeting, but in a subject line in a document that had carried weight, something about ownership, something about transition, and his gaze shifted from Darius to the company logo behind the desk and back again, the pieces not yet aligned, but moving towards something that would not stay hidden much longer. And in the center of it all, Darius remained still, composed, letting the room reveal itself, letting every assumption settle into place. Because the moment had not arrived yet, but it was close, and when it did, it would not be loud, it would not be chaotic, it would be precise, controlled, and impossible to ignore. The silence at the front desk did not break. It thickened, stretching across the lobby like a quiet tension that everyone could feel but no one wanted to name. And Darius Cole stood exactly where he had stopped, not shifting his weight, not glancing away, simply allowing the moment to unfold around him as if time itself had slowed to match his pace, while the receptionist's fingers hovered uncertainly above the tablet screen, waiting for a response that did not come, and the security guard beside her straightened his stance just a little more, stepping closer now, closing the distance in a way that suggested escalation without openly declaring it, because in his mind the situation had already crossed from confusion into noncompliance, and protocol demanded action, even when certainty was missing. "Sir, I am going to need you to sign in or step outside," the guard said, his voice firmer this time, less patient, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. And a few feet away, the man who had whispered earlier folded his arms, watching with renewed confidence, as if the outcome he expected was finally taking shape, while two employees near the elevator slowed their conversation, their eyes flicking between Darius and the desk, drawn in by the growing tension that now pulsed through the room like a current. Darius lowered his phone slightly, his gaze lifting to meet the guards, calm and steady, not confrontational, not submissive, just present in a way that made the air feel heavier. And when he spoke, his voice remained even, measured with the same quiet control he had carried since the moment he arrived. "I do not sign into places I already belong to," he said, and the words landed differently than expected. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise enough to cause a brief pause, a flicker of hesitation that passed across the receptionist's face before she quickly masked it, defaulting back to procedure like a shield. "Everyone signs in," she replied, her tone tightening, because now it was no longer just about policy. It was about maintaining control of a situation that no longer felt simple. And behind Darius, Caleb took another step closer, his attention fully captured now, his mind racing through fragments of internal emails, executive summaries, acquisition notices, the kind of information that interns were not supposed to fully grasp, but could not help absorbing. And then it clicked, not completely, but enough to send a jolt of realization through him, because the name Cole had appeared recently, attached to something significant, something that had shifted the structure of the entire company. And his eyes widened slightly as he looked at Darius again, this time not seeing a stranger, but a possibility that no one else in the room had yet considered. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," the guard added, stepping forward just enough to assert presence without crossing a visible line, his hand gesturing toward the entrance behind them, a silent suggestion of where this interaction should end. And for a moment the lobby seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether Darius would comply or resist, whether this would dissolve quietly or escalate into something more public, something more uncomfortable. Darius did neither. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the elevator bank, then back to the desk, his expression unchanged, his composure intact. And in that small movement, there was something unmistakable, a sense of orientation that did not belong to someone unfamiliar with the building, but to someone who knew exactly where he was going and why. And Caleb saw it, felt it, the certainty sharpening in his chest as the pieces began to align, because this was not hesitation. This was patience, the kind that comes from knowing the outcome long before anyone else does. "Last chance, sir," the guard said, his voice now edged with finality, the moment narrowing, tightening, drawing a clear line between compliance and consequence. And the receptionist turned slightly in her chair, her hand hovering near the phone, as if preparing to call for additional support, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a cautious resolve, because in her world, situations like this had predictable endings, and none of them involved the man standing calmly in front of her being right. But Darius simply nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if marking the moment. And then he raised his phone again, his thumb moving across the screen with quiet precision. No urgency, no hesitation, just a single deliberate action that went unnoticed by most, but not by Caleb, whose eyes locked onto the movement, whose breath caught slightly, as instinct told him that whatever happened next would change everything in that room. And for the first time since the confrontation began, doubt did not just flicker, it settled, spreading quietly through the space as the certainty that had once filled it began to crack, just enough to let something else through, something heavier, something real, something that none of them were ready for. The movement of Darius Cole's thumb across his phone screen was small, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention. But Caleb saw it clearly, and something in that single motion made his chest tighten, because it did not look like a man sending a casual message or checking the time. It looked deliberate, intentional, like the first domino in a sequence already set in motion. And across the lobby, the subtle hum of conversation began to fade as more eyes drifted toward the front desk, drawn in by the stillness that now surrounded Darius like a quiet gravity, pulling attention without effort, while the security guard shifted again, his patience thinning, his authority pressing forward in small, controlled increments. "Sir, I'm not going to repeat myself," he said, his voice now firm enough to carry across the near stretch of the lobby, turning what had been a contained interaction into something more public, something that others could no longer ignore. And the receptionist glanced at him briefly, then back at Darius, her posture stiffening as she prepared to escalate, her hand finally lowering onto the desk phone, fingers brushing the buttons, but not pressing them yet, because even now, something held her back, something she could not quite explain. Darius did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched again, heavier this time, filled with unspoken assumptions, with judgments already formed, with outcomes already decided by everyone except him. And then he spoke, his voice calm, level, cutting through the tension without raising itself above it. "You're about to make a mistake you cannot undo," he said, and the words did not sound like a threat, did not carry anger, but they landed with a quiet weight that made the receptionist pause, her finger hovering just above the phone, while the guard let out a short breath through his nose, dismissing it as resistance dressed up in calm language. "We follow policy here," the guard replied, his tone tightening, because control was slipping in ways he could not name, and policy was the only thing he could anchor to, the only thing that made sense in a moment that no longer did. And behind Darius, Caleb stepped closer still, his voice low but urgent as he leaned slightly toward the desk. "Wait," he said, just loud enough to be heard, and the receptionist turned to him, surprised, her brows pulling together as if questioning why an intern would step into something like this. But Caleb did not back down, his eyes fixed on Darius, his mind racing faster now as the memory sharpened, becoming clearer with each passing second. "I think I have seen his name," Caleb continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, the uncertainty giving way to something more solid. "Cole. Darius Cole," he said, and the name hung in the air, unfamiliar to most, but not to all, because somewhere in the back offices, in executive emails, in boardroom documents, that name carried weight, and even if the receptionist and the guard did not recognize it yet, the shift had begun, subtle but undeniable. The man beside the receptionist scoffed softly, shaking his head. "That does not mean anything," he muttered, trying to pull the moment back into something manageable, something predictable. But the confidence in his voice had faded, replaced by a thin edge of doubt that he could not fully hide. And across the room, one of the employees near the elevators took a step forward, curiosity overriding caution, while another reached in her bag and pulled out her phone, not to record, not yet, but to check something, to search, to confirm, because the energy in the room had changed, and people could feel it even if they could not explain it. Darius glanced briefly at Caleb, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough to acknowledge him, enough to confirm that he had heard. And in that look there was something steady, something reassuring, not gratitude, not surprise, just recognition, like two people who understood the same truth at different speeds. And then Darius returned his gaze to the desk, to the receptionist, to the guard, to the space where assumption still tried to hold its ground. The phone in his hand buzzed once, soft but clear, and he lifted it slightly, not checking it, not reacting to it outwardly, but letting that small sound exist in the silence, a signal that something had responded, something beyond the lobby, beyond the immediate moment. And the receptionist noticed it, her eyes flicking down, then back up, her expression shifting again, uncertainty pressing in from all sides now. Because this was no longer just a man refusing to sign in. This was something else, something she could not categorize, and that made it harder to control. "If you do not comply, we will have to escort you out," the guard said, his voice now carrying the finality of a decision already made. But even as he said it, there was a hesitation, small but present, because the room no longer felt fully aligned with him. The certainty that had supported him moments ago now fractured by doubt, by Caleb's words, by the quiet confidence of the man in front of him. And in that fracture, the balance began to shift. Darius nodded once more, slow and deliberate, as if marking another point in a timeline only he could see. And then he spoke again, his voice steady, unwavering. "Go ahead," he said, and the simplicity of those words did not match the weight behind them. Because this was not surrender, not compliance, it was permission, the kind that comes from someone who already understands the outcome. And as those words settled into the space, the lobby itself seemed to hold still, as if waiting for the next move, for the moment when assumption would finally meet reality, and everything would change. The guard took a step forward, closing the final gap between authority and action, his posture firm, his intention clear now as the moment tipped past hesitation into enforcement, and the receptionist's hand finally pressed down on the phone, her voice low as she called for additional support. Her words clipped and procedural, but her eyes remained fixed on Darius Cole, as if trying to reconcile the calm in him with the situation unfolding around him, because nothing about his stillness matched the escalation that had just been set in motion, and that contradiction made the air feel heavier, more fragile, like something was about to break, but no one knew exactly how. "Sir, you need to come with me," the guard said, extending his arms slightly, not touching but guiding, drawing a line that he expected to be followed. And for the first time since the confrontation began, a few people in the lobby shifted uncomfortably, the quiet observers now becoming witnesses, their attention sharpened by the sense that this had gone further than it should have, and Caleb felt it too. The pressure building in his chest, the realization now clearer, louder, impossible to ignore because the name, the posture, the certainty, it all aligned, and yet no one else seemed willing to say it out loud. Not fully, not yet. Darius did not move, not away, not toward. He simply remained where he stood, his gaze steady, his presence unshaken. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same controlled weight. "You are crossing a line you do not understand," he said, and the words did not rise in volume, but they deepened, settling into the space with a quiet authority that made the guard hesitate for just a fraction of a second before pushing forward again. Because backing down now would mean admitting doubt, and doubt had no place in his role. "We are done talking," the guard replied, his tone final, his patience gone. And he gestured again, more firmly this time, signaling the end of negotiation, the beginning of removal. And around them the lobby seemed to narrow, the edges of the moment closing in as more employees paused, more conversations faded, more attention gathered into a single point at the front desk where assumption and reality were about to collide. Caleb stepped forward again, this time unable to hold back, his voice louder, urgent, cutting through the tension. "You need to stop," he said, and the words drew immediate attention. The receptionist turning sharply toward him, the guard glancing back with irritation. But Caleb did not retreat, his eyes locked on Darius, then shifting to the others. "You do not understand who this is," he continued, and now the room reacted, subtle but undeniable, a ripple of unease spreading through those close enough to hear, because uncertainty had been present before, but now it had a voice, and that changed everything. The man beside the receptionist shook his head quickly, trying to dismiss it. "It does not matter," he said, but his tone lacked conviction, his earlier confidence replaced by something thinner, something strained, and across the lobby a woman near the elevator stepped closer, her phone now in her hand, her attention fully engaged, not recording, not yet, but ready. Because the moment felt like it was building towards something that could not be undone. Darius remained composed, unmoved by the rising tension, unmoved by the voices, unmoved by the guard's insistence. And for a brief second, his mind drifted, not away from the moment, but through it, back to a memory that carried the same weight, the same tone, the same quiet dismissal that had followed him years ago when he was 19. Standing outside a corporate office in Detroit, holding a delivery uniform that was not even his, filling in for someone else, and a man in a suit had looked at him and said, "Leave it at the door, drivers do not come inside," without ever asking, without ever considering, reducing him to a role based on nothing more than appearance. And Darius had stood there then too, silent, absorbing it, storing it, not as anger, but as fuel, as a reminder of how easily people revealed themselves when they believed they held power. Back in the present, the guard took another step, his patience fully spent now, his authority pressing forward into action, and the receptionist's voice echoed faintly from the phone as she confirmed the situation, her words formal, detached, but her eyes never leaving Darius, because something about him refused to fit the narrative they had built, and that mismatch was growing harder to ignore with every passing second. "This is your final warning," the guard said, and the words carried across the lobby, drawing even more attention, turning the moment into something public, something visible, something that could not be quietly dismissed later. And in response, Darius exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in resignation, but in control, like a man measuring time, and then he lifted his phone again. This time bringing it to his ear, his movement calm, deliberate. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear enough for those closest to hear. "Yes," he said, "it is time." And that single sentence shifted the air in a way no one could fully explain, because it did not sound like a reaction. It sounded like a signal. And as it settled into the space, the tension reached its peak, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. Because whatever happened next would not just resolve the situation, it would redefine it entirely. The words "it is time" did not echo loudly through the lobby, but they carried a weight that settled into every corner of the space, as if something unseen had just been set into motion. And for a brief moment, nothing happened. No alarms, no sudden reactions, just the quiet hum of the building continuing as it always had, fluorescent lights steady, elevator doors opening and closing in the distance. Employees frozen in place between action and hesitation. And then it began, subtle at first, almost easy to miss. The large digital display mounted behind the reception desk flickered, the company logo dissolving into a blank screen before shifting again, lines of text loading slowly as if pulling from a system deeper than anything visible in the lobby. And the receptionist noticed it first, her eyes darting upward, confusion breaking through her composure as the screen changed without her input, without warning. "What is happening?" she whispered. Not to anyone in particular, but the question hung in the air, pulling attention upward, drawing every gaze toward the screen as the text resolved into something clear, something unmistakable, bold letters against a dark background that read "Executive Access Update in Progress." And beneath it, a name began to appear, each letter forming with deliberate precision. Dariuscole. And the room shifted instantly, not with noise, but with recognition, with realization that moved faster than words. Because even those who had not known the name before could feel its weight now, could see the reaction in others, could sense the structure of the moment collapsing in real time. Caleb's breath caught as the final letters locked into place. His earlier suspicion now confirmed with a clarity that sent a sharp jolt through him, and he looked at the guard. Then at the receptionist, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with urgency. "That is him," he said, and this time no one dismissed it. No one laughed, because the evidence was no longer abstract. It was right there, undeniable, displayed for everyone to see. The guard stepped back slightly, not consciously, not as a decision, But as a reaction, his posture shifting as the certainty he had held onto began to slip away, replaced by something unfamiliar, something heavier, doubt mixed with realization, and the receptionist's hand slowly lifted from the phone, her call unfinished, her authority suspended in the space between what she thought she knew and what was now unfolding in front of her. Darius lowered his phone from his ear, the call already complete, his expression unchanged, his presence as steady as it had been from the beginning. Because for him, this was not a surprise, not a sudden turn, but a continuation of a process that had been set in motion long before he ever stepped out of the car that morning. And when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, did not demand attention. It simply claimed it. "You asked me to prove I belong here," he said, and his gaze moved from the receptionist to the guard, then briefly to the others who had watched, who had judged, who had assumed. "This is your answer." The words landed with a finality that did not need reinforcement, because the room itself had already shifted, the balance of power no longer where it had been moments ago. And across the lobby, phones began to buzz, notifications lighting up screens as internal messages pushed through the system, emails marked urgent, subject lines carrying the same name now displayed above the desk. And one of the employees near the elevators glanced down at her phone, her eyes widening as she read, her voice breaking the silence. "Majority ownership transfer effective immediately," she said, the words pulling more attention, more confirmation, more reality into the moment. The man who had laughed earlier took a step back, his arms dropping to his sides, his confidence gone, replaced by a hollow uncertainty as he looked from Darius to the screen and back again, trying to reconcile the image he had formed with the truth now in front of him, and finding no way to do it, while the guard's stance softened, his authority dissolving into something quieter, something uncertain, because the line he thought he was enforcing had never been his to draw. Darius remained where he stood, not moving forward, not pressing the moment, simply allowing it to settle, allowing the room to absorb what had just been revealed, because this was not about reaction, not about confrontation. It was about clarity, about showing, not telling, about letting the truth stand on its own without needing to be raised or defended. And in that stillness, the entire lobby seemed to recalibrate. Every assumption questioned, every judgment reconsidered, every voice that had spoken before now silent, waiting, because the next words would not come from them. They would come from him, and they would define everything that followed. The room did not erupt. It did not explode into chaos. It collapsed inward, quietly, like a structure realizing too late that its foundation had been wrong all along. And every person in the lobby felt it. That subtle but undeniable shift where certainty gave way to consequence, where confidence turned into calculation, where the weight of what had just happened began to settle into something real, something permanent. And Darius Cole stood at the center of it without moving, without raising his voice, without needing to, because the reveal had already done the work, the truth now visible, undeniable, irreversible. The security guard straightened instinctively, but the posture was no longer the same. The authority behind it fractured, uncertain, his earlier commands echoing in his own mind now, with a different tone, a different meaning. And he took a small step back, not retreating, but recalibrating, as if trying to find a position that no longer existed, while the receptionist slowly stood from her chair, her movements careful, deliberate, as if any sudden motion might make the situation worse, her eyes fixed on Darius with a mixture of disbelief and realization that she could not fully hide. "Sir, Mr. Cole," she began, her voice catching slightly as she corrected herself mid-sentence, the shift in address marking the shift in power more clearly than anything else in the room. And for a moment she paused, searching for words that could bridge the gap between what had just happened and what came next, but nothing felt sufficient. Nothing felt right, because there was no script for this, no training module for reversing a mistake of this magnitude in real time. Darius looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a steady clarity that made it impossible to look away. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority it always had, but now it landed differently, Now it held weight that no one could ignore. "You did not know who I was," he said. And the words were not accusatory. They were factual, precise. "That is not the problem," he continued, his gaze shifting slightly to include the guard, the man beside the desk, the others who had watched, who had assumed, who had allowed the moment to unfold without question. "The problem is how you treated someone you thought did not matter." The sentence settled into the space like a final piece of truth, something that did not need to be argued, did not need to be defended, because everyone in the room had seen it, had been part of it, had contributed to it in ways small and large. And now they were all standing inside the result. Caleb stood still a few feet away, his heart still racing, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet certainty, and he watched as the room responded, not with noise, but with silence, the kind that comes when people recognize themselves in a moment they cannot undo. And across the lobby, one of the employees lowered her phone slowly, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more reflective, something heavier, while another glanced down at the floor, avoiding eye contact entirely, as if distance could soften what had just been revealed. The man who had laughed earlier cleared his throat softly, the sound awkward, misplaced, his confidence gone completely now as he looked at Darius with a kind of forced neutrality, as if trying to reset the interaction, to erase what had already happened, but the attempt fell flat, because the moment could not be undone, only acknowledged. The security guard finally spoke again, but the tone had changed, the certainty replaced by something more measured, more careful. "Mr. Cole, I was following protocol," he said, and even as he spoke, the words sounded different, thinner, less solid than they had before, because protocol without judgment had just been exposed for what it was: incomplete, insufficient, and Darius nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. As an excuse, protocol is only as good as the people who apply it, he replied, and the response was immediate, precise, leaving no room for deflection, no space to hide behind procedure, because responsibility had just been placed exactly where it belonged. The receptionist lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, her voice quieter now, more careful. "We apologize," she said, and the words were simple, expected, but they carried a weight that came from understanding, not just obligation, and Darius held her gaze for a moment, long enough to let the apology exist, long enough to acknowledge it without diminishing it. And then he spoke again, his tone unchanged. "This is not about apologies," he said, and the words redirected the entire moment, shifting it away from resolution and towards something deeper, something more lasting. "It is about accountability." The sentence landed with finality, drawing a clear line between what had happened and what needed to happen next. And in that moment, the lobby was no longer just a place of business. It was a space where truth had been revealed, where assumptions had been exposed, where power had been redefined not by title or position, but by clarity, by presence, by the quiet strength of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. The word accountability did not fade. It settled, anchoring itself in the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore. And for a moment no one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend, only the reality of what had just been exposed. And then, almost on cue, the system responded, not with noise, but with precision, as the receptionist's screen flickered, her access panel refreshing automatically, and a notification appeared, bold and immediate: executive override initiated, followed by a series of internal alerts cascading through the system in real time, each one confirming what had already been revealed, but now with authority behind it, with structure, with consequence. The security guard's radio crackled softly at his side, a voice coming through clear and direct, requesting confirmation of the situation at the front lobby. But before he could respond, another message cut in, sharper, more formal, instructing him to stand down and await further direction. And that moment, small as it was, marked the shift completely, because the authority he had relied on was no longer his to exercise. It had moved above him, beyond him, and he knew it. The receptionist's phone rang, the line she had used moments ago, now returning with urgency, and she hesitated before answering, her hand slightly unsteady as she lifted the receiver, her voice quiet as she spoke, confirming her name, her position, and then listening, her expression changing with each second, the color draining slightly from her face as the instructions came through, precise, immediate, and irreversible. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." And when she lowered the phone, the room felt different again, not just tense, but resolved, like a decision had already been made somewhere far above them, and all that remained was to carry it out. The man who had laughed earlier shifted uneasily, his eyes moving between the receptionist and Darius, searching for something to hold on to, some explanation that would soften what was happening. But there was none, and the realization sat heavily on him now, his earlier words echoing back with a weight they did not carry before. Caleb remained still, his earlier urgency now replaced by a quiet focus, watching as the system itself began to reflect the truth that had been revealed, watching as the structure of the company responded not to noise, not to confrontation, but to authority, real authority, the kind that did not need to announce itself loudly to be effective. The receptionist stood fully now, her posture straight but careful, her eyes meeting Darius again, this time without hesitation, without assumption, only recognition. And when she spoke, her voice carried a different tone, one shaped not by policy, but by understanding. "Mr. Cole, we have received instructions from corporate," she said, and the phrase itself sounded different now, heavier, more significant, because corporate was no longer an abstract concept. It was him. It had been him all along. The guard stepped back another half step, his stance no longer assertive, but neutral, waiting, watching, his role reduced to observation as the situation moved beyond his control. And across the lobby, more phones buzzed, more screens lit up, the ripple effect spreading through the building as employees began to read, to understand, to connect the moment unfolding in the lobby with the messages now appearing in their hands. Effective immediately, the receptionist continued, her voice steadying as she read, "All front desk and security interactions are under review pending executive assessment." And the words landed with clarity, not harsh, not loud, but definitive, drawing a direct line between what had happened and what would follow. And for the first time, the consequences were no longer abstract. They were present, real, unfolding in front of everyone. The man beside her lowered his gaze, his shoulders dropping slightly as the weight of the situation settled in, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something reflective, while the guard nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the message without resistance, because there was no space left for resistance, only acceptance. Darius remained composed, his presence unchanged, not stepping forward, not pressing the moment, simply allowing it to unfold as it needed to. Because this was not about proving a point anymore, it was about letting the system respond to truth, letting accountability take its place without force, without spectacle, just as it should have from the beginning. And in that stillness, the lobby transformed, not physically, but in meaning, no longer just a place where people entered and exited, but a place where something had been revealed, something that could not be unseen, where assumptions had been tested and found lacking, where authority had been clarified not by appearance, but by reality, and where the consequences of a single moment of judgment were now being carried out with quiet, unmistakable precision. The lobby no longer felt like a place of motion. It felt like a moment suspended, held together by the quiet weight of everything that had just unfolded, and Darius Cole stood at its center not as a disruptor, not as a force of chaos, but as something far more controlled, far more deliberate, a presence that had not changed from the moment he stepped out of the car. Only the perception around him had shifted, revealing what had always been there beneath the surface. And as the system continued to process, as the notifications settled into silence, as the last echoes of confusion faded into understanding, the space itself seemed to exhale, slowly, carefully, like it was adjusting to a new truth. The receptionist remained standing, her posture composed now, but different, no longer driven by assumption, no longer guided by surface judgment, her eyes steady as she looked at Darius, not searching for answers anymore, but acknowledging them. And beside her, the security guard stood with a quiet stillness, his earlier authority replaced by reflection, his role now reduced to witnessing the outcome of a moment that had slipped beyond his control, while the man who had laughed earlier avoided eye contact entirely, his gaze fixed somewhere distant, as if distance could soften the realization settling in his chest. Across the lobby, employees began to move again, slowly at first, their conversations subdued, their voices lower, not out of fear but out of awareness, because something had shifted in the room, something that would follow them beyond this moment, beyond this building, into the way they saw the next person who walked through those doors. Caleb stood where he was, watching, absorbing, understanding, his earlier urgency replaced by a quiet respect, not just for the man in front of him, but for the way the moment had been handled, without anger, without escalation, without the need to prove anything beyond what was already true. And in that understanding, something changed in him too, something that would shape the way he saw the world moving forward. Darius took a single step forward then, not rushed, not dramatic, just a continuation of the path he had always intended to take, and the movement itself carried weight, drawing attention without demanding it. And as he approached the reception desk, the space around him opened naturally, no one needing to be told to move, no one questioning his direction anymore, because the question of belonging had already been answered, clearly, completely. He paused for a brief moment, his gaze moving across the room one last time, taking in the faces, the reactions, the silence that had replaced the earlier noise. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority it always had, but now it settled deeper, reaching further, leaving something behind that would remain long after he was gone. "I did not raise my voice," he said, the words measured, deliberate, each one placed with intention. "I did not argue. I did not demand respect." And he paused, just long enough for the truth of that statement to settle into the room, for everyone present to recognize it, to connect it with what they had witnessed. And then he continued, his tone steady, unwavering. "I let you show me who you are." And the sentence landed with a quiet finality that needed no explanation, no elaboration, because it reflected the entire moment back to them, unfiltered, undeniable. The receptionist lowered her gaze slightly, not in shame, but in acknowledgement, understanding the weight of what had been revealed, while the guard nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried recognition, acceptance, and across the lobby, a few heads bowed subtly, not in submission, but in reflection, as the lesson of the moment settled in. Darius held the silence for a second longer, then added one final sentence, his voice calm, but firm enough to anchor itself in the memory of everyone present. "Respect is not something you offer based on what you see," he said. "It is something you show before you know." And with that, he turned, not waiting for a response, not seeking validation, because none was needed. The moment had already spoken for itself. And as he walked toward the elevators, the doors opened before he even reached them, a quiet acknowledgement from the system, from the building, from the structure that now reflected his presence fully, completely. And as he stepped inside, the lobby remained still for a moment longer, holding on to the silence, holding on to the lesson, holding on to the truth that had been revealed without force, without noise, without anything more than clarity. And then, slowly, life resumed, but not the same as before. Because something had changed, something that would not be forgotten, something that would shape the next moment, and the next, long after Darius Cole was no longer in the room.